The MCAT podcast, session number 148. A collaboration between the medical school headquarters and Next Step Test Prep, the MCAT podcast is here to make sure you have the information you need to succeed on your MCAT test day. We all know that the MCAT is one of the biggest hurdles you'll face as a pre-med, and we're here to give you the motivation and information that you need to know to help get you the score you deserve so you can one day call yourself a physician. Welcome to the MCAT podcast. My name is Dr. Ryan Gray, your host here every week, where I get to talk to Clara from Next Step Test Prep. If you are on your MCAT journey, which you obviously are, or you wouldn't be listening to this, you need to go to nextsteptestprep.com and check out all of their free resources, including a free full-length exam, along with their diagnostic exam. You can go to medicalschoolhq.net/nextstep to check out that free diagnostic and free full length. Again, medicalschoolhq.net/nextstep. Today we have a great discussion about reviewing full lengths and Q banks and everything else. Clara, welcome back to the MCAT podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm excited. We are finished with Next Step Full Length 10. That took about a year to get through all of those. And I hope that was helpful for students. I hope you have gone through and scored my exam. Did you get my score?
I didn't.
Oh, man.
But I'm sure it was great.
I think it was.
528.
But 527. Let's not be too generous.
It's fair.
So a student finishes their full-length exam, and I think the majority of the time, it's like a notch on their belt. Like, okay, I got an exam under my belt. Now I'm ready to move on to my next exam. And it seems like talking to you and talking to all of the MCAT experts out there, that's just a huge mistake. Just jumping from exam to exam to exam, trying to get as many questions under your belt without actually reviewing and understanding kind of what happened, debriefing and doing as we call it in the military, a post-mortem, figure out what happened. And so what are your thoughts on that?
Totally. Yeah, it's actually really interesting. I feel like a lot of students come in and they think like exactly what you are describing, where you want to take either like as many full lengths as possible, or maybe if you put off taking a full length too long in your prep, you might think, oh, like I need to take them like every other day or every third day, and then review can totally fall by the wayside. But the funny thing about full length prep is that if you don't review your full lengths really carefully, and especially if you don't review them at all, they're essentially useless. Just like taking two full lengths in a row or something like that is actually virtually useless because you're not actually learning from your mistakes. So full length review has to be a lot more in depth than students initially think it does.
A general rule of thumb that I've heard is review twice as long as it took you to take the test. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's definitely the ideal case. So twice as long. So that means 8-hour full length, 16 hours of review, which seems crazy, but it's definitely not. Now, the bare minimum I would ever suggest, like let's say you're really short on time or you have a full-time job or something like that, the bare minimum is the same amount of time. So if it took you 8 hours, spend 8 hours at least on review.
And what are they doing this whole time? Like 8 hours, it seems like forever. I only missed 10 questions. It should only take me 20 minutes to look over those 10 questions.
So first of all, if you only miss 10 questions, you're in awesome shape. But you should still be reviewing. So basically that hits the nail on the head with regard to the common misconception students have about reviewing, which is that you should definitely review the questions you got wrong, but you also absolutely need to review the questions you got correct. And questions you got correct can actually fall into a few different buckets, which is why it's really important to review them. So usually there will be some questions where like you picked an answer and you're 100% certain that, okay, that's the correct answer. And then it turns out that that was the correct answer. And so it's like, okay, you should still review that because maybe the wrong answers are terms that you don't know, or maybe the explanation gives you some extra insight. Or maybe you read the explanation and you see that they solved it a different way than you did. And now you have an alternate way to solve that kind of problem. But beyond that, there's a lot of other ways you can get an answer correct and still need to review it really thoroughly. Like a lot of times you might just guess and guess the correct answer. And then, like, oh, of course, you want to review that just like you'd review a wrong answer because it was just totally random that you happened to get it. And then, of course, the last bucket is questions that you got right, but you got right for the wrong reasons. So maybe you start reading the explanation, you're like, "Oh my God, I didn't do it this way at all. I just picked C because because it looked good or because it had this term in it," and then you get a lot of extra insight.
Okay. I like the thought process behind, well, I got it right, but maybe I got it right for the wrong reason. And if you've been listening to this podcast enough, you'll know that I get a lot of questions right for the completely wrong reason, even though I think I'm pretty confident. And as a student is going through their full length, how do you recommend that they, in the moment, because it's hard to go back through all however many hundreds of questions there are, it's hard to go back and go, okay, I remember on this question I was questioning X, Y, and Z, or I thought about A, B, and C. In the moment, as they're taking a full length, how do you recommend potentially a student keep track of those thoughts, keep track of the doubts, keep track of where their mind potentially wants to go with an answer, so that when they go back and review, they can go, okay, I remember, or they don't have to remember, I can see that during this question, I was thinking this, and this is why I got it wrong. Or I was thinking that, and that's why I got it right.
That's a great question. And yeah, that is really a struggle. I've tutored a lot of students in the past who get a question right, get it right for the wrong reasons, and then they sort of forgot how they thought through it, and so they sort of might assume, oh, here's the explanation. I'm reading through it. That sounds normal. That sounds rational. That must be why I picked this answer. And of course, then you're missing out on your entire actual thought process. But at the same time, usually you aren't going to want to during a full length that's timed. You're not going to want to like stop and write down like, oh, on number 19, I thought it was C for these reasons. So you have to fall into this sort of happy medium with this. And so what I recommend doing for timed full length tests is to utilize the actual features of the test as closely as possible to actually help you in your review. So that's things like strike through, right? You can cross out wrong answers or answers you think are wrong. So I found it so helpful when my tutoring students will cross out the answers they think are wrong, because then that's a great red flag if, like, let's say you get to your review and you're like, oh, I think I picked C for this reason, but you actually crossed out like, the right answer, for example, or you crossed out the second closest answer and then you didn't cross out a very, very wrong answer. It can be a really good way to jog your memory and think, okay, like I remember now what I was doing because I crossed out A and C, and here's why.
Yeah.
Totally. And other things too, like you can use highlighting in that regard, because you can actually highlight the question stem as well as the answer choices, or you can use your notes. Of course, if you are already a note taker, you can definitely jot down just very quickly, oh, C irrational or C scientifically false or something like that, without stopping and writing down like a whole essay.
I wonder if we can create a worksheet for students that has questions 1 through however many, how many questions on there?
230.
230. So 1 through 230, and in a list, and then the columns across have knew the answer, guess the answer, like just going through and as a student, even during a time test, because I don't think this would add much time, maybe a second to every question. After they click their answer, they just quickly like check off a column on the box for each question. I wonder if that would potentially be helpful.
Yeah. Oh, it totally could be. So that's one avenue you can take. So you could do some sort of sheet or something like that, and just as long as you pre-made the sheet ahead of time, you've like determined these categories, like like you said, I knew the answer, or maybe I had no idea at all and I guessed, versus I thought I knew. Or you could actually do like confidence intervals, or confidence ratings, essentially, where you're like, we've actually played around with the idea of implementing a feature like that in the future, where the student can actually say, oh, I'm 80% sure on this one, I'm 10% sure on that one. And that wouldn't be that hard to write down on a piece of paper. So that's absolutely something you could try. And one cool way you can play around with this is like if you're kind of nervous about the time it might take you when doing a full length, if you have access to enough full length tests, you can often break some up into individual sections and do them just individually. And that's something I totally recommend for, say, students who have access to like all 4 AAMC full lengths and then maybe all 10 next step full lengths. You aren't going to have to do 14 full lengths in the vast majority of cases. So say you break up full length, 9, you're like, I'm just going to do the chem phys section and I'm going to try this approach of writing down on this piece of paper how sure I was, et cetera, because there's a lot less pressure in just doing an individual section. If it takes you a little bit extra time, fine. You're getting a lot of insight about yourself in the process.
So this review process, a lot of students will take this and go, okay, I'm going to do that with my full lengths. But what if they do break up a full length or utilize the next step Q banks and are going through a Q bank? I think a lot of students won't potentially tie that into, oh, I need to review this as thoroughly as a full length.
That's absolutely true. I think a lot of times people, even if you're, really familiar with the MCAT and with like best practices and that sort of thing, you'll usually set aside that 8 hours after you take a full length for review, but you might not plan in your day, I just spent an hour and a half on a Q bank. I need to spend at least an hour and a half reviewing it. And that's totally still true, that rule of thumb, where you want to spend at least as much time reviewing it as you did taking it, and ideally up to twice as much. So the nice thing about most resources like QBanks, including the Next Step QBank, is that you can opt to review each question immediately after you answer it. So you could just do the whole QBank, maybe 30 questions or something like that, and then review the whole thing. So that's kind of similar to what you do for a full length. But I've actually found that early on in your prep, it's going to be typically better to actually review immediately after you answer each question, if that's an option, which again, it typically is. So let's say you just answered question number 1. It's a question about, embryogenesis or development or something like that. And you are kind of fuzzy on those terms. Well, you can immediately click as soon as you've chosen an answer, click to see the solution. And then that way it sort of mitigates that problem that we were dealing with earlier where you forget your thought process after you finish the test. So you're getting immediate feedback. So that can be super helpful, at least early on.
Nice. What else about reviewing a test do we need to talk about that we haven't talked about yet? Or reviewing in general for the MCAT?
Definitely. So there's a couple things. So one is just to not ignore the passage, right? Because I feel like all these conversations about review always gravitate toward the questions, which makes sense because the questions are where you get the points. But I think a lot of students will just go through question by question and they almost like won't even look at the passage, or like they'll only look at the passage if the explanation to a question references you back to a certain point. And that's not ideal because there's so much more information you can get out of the passage too. So what I recommend if you're doing whether a full length or any other practice that involves passages, to actually take like 3 or 4 minutes before you jump right into the first question and look over the passage, reread the whole thing, take a look at what you highlighted. So let's say you didn't highlight anything, can you remember why that was? Or you highlighted certain terms, which ones were they? Because that is how you're really going to get a handle on optimal passage strategy, right? Like let's say you highlighted certain terms, and then once you're done with your little passage review, you get to like question 3, and you see that there's a whole nother term that was really crucial for that question that you didn't highlight. So now because the way you work through the passage is so fresh in your mind now, you can actually get these little hints, little tips about ways you can modify your passage strategy.
All right, so there you have it. Another great episode of the MCAT podcast for you. As I mentioned earlier, go to medicalschoolhq.net/nextstep, and you can get access to their free diagnostic as well as their full-length exam as well. A free full-length, just for you. Diagnostic and full-length, medicalschoolhq.net/nextstep. I hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time here on the MCAT podcast.
This is MedEd Media.